The character of a village like Dorchester is largely established by its traditional building materials. And over the centuries, these have changed. New materials that are more durable have been discovered, and old materials have been rejected. And one of the most potent factors in that change is fashion. It's a very human desire to want to give the public face of your building the most modern and up-to-date appearance. And that has happened with the historic buildings in Dorchester. I mean, for example, if you look behind me, all the buildings there are timber framed, and yet only one of them still displays proudly its timber framing on its front elevation. Most of the buildings in the high street are timber framed, even if that frame has been hidden behind a later coat of render or indeed of brickwork. However, this flamboyant timbered building behind me is not timber framed at all. The timber here is purely decorative, designed by Gilbert Scott in 1878, possibly the last building that he designed himself. It was paid for by the Reverend Macfarlane, and it was built to provide accommodation for the principal of the missionary college that Macfarlane founded, with a young man's institute on the ground floor. When it was first built, it was a much more subtle building. The current contrast between the black timber and the white infill is a modern affectation. Originally, there was no white infill. It was brickwork, it was left exposed, and the timber was not painted. So the decorative flamboyance was much less pronounced. Here in the yard of the Fleur Inn, we can see the most basic building material of all, and that is earth. Known locally as cob, it has different names in different parts of the country. Cob is essentially earth, dug on site, mixed together, and then layered. You build it up a layer at a time, let it dry, and then build another layer on top. What you need to do is to weatherproof the foundation and keep the rain off the top. So there's a saying in Devon that if you give a cob wall a good pair of boots and a good hat, it'll last forever. And here you can see the stone foundation. There is the cob. Behind all of this foliage, there is actually a tiled roof that overshoots, so stops the rain coming in. Now, some people believe that cob must have been the earliest building material in Dorchester. And there is some evidence in the locality for it being used at an early stage. In Wallingford, cob houses dating back to the 12th century were excavated 20 years ago. But all of the cob that I know in Dorchester is very much later. The earliest building material is timber. There are two schools of carpentry in Dorchester, both using the same material, wood, but using it in a very different way. One uses great big curved timbers composed of the trunk and the first branch of the tree, split in half so that you get a matching pair. These are called Cruck Trusses. They form the partition between each bay or each unit of a timber-framed building, and they are assembled. That is, you lay the cruck truss on the ground and join it together. You rear it up into its vertical position. You put the horizontal timbers, the purlins, between each truss, and you rear the building in that way. The other school is box framing, and I'll explain that later. Cruck-framed buildings are low. That's because of the limitations of the timber trusses. So in Dorchester, they're mainly 1.5 stories high. That is, the upper story is in the roof space. They're very, very difficult to spot because where they survive it's because they've been adapted and changed for modern standards. We're outside the fleur-de-lis, and you wouldn't believe it, but this is a fully cruck-framed building. If you look at the front elevation, that was given a facelift in the late 19th century. So it's 2 full stories high, it's rendered, and it's got a Welsh slate roof. That Welsh slate only comes to Dorchester with the railway age after about 1840. This is the public face of the Fleur, and if you want to find clues to its original construction, we have to go through the archway. Here you can see the foot of one of the Cruck Trusses. It's curving away up there. The foot has been cut away, but that's the simple evidence for the whole Cruck frame for the rest of the Fleur until we come into the yard. And here, away from the public view, you can see that the Fleur really is only 1.5 stories high. It's only on the public elevation to attract customers at how up-to-date this inn is that they've given us the illusion of a 2-story building. Just one further house up the high street from the Fleur is this row of cottages. They are all cruck-framed, all 1.5 stories high. We can't look at them too closely because they're being rethatched, and most of the cruck-framed buildings in Dorchester were thatched. There are particular traditions about the way you use thatch. Thatch in Dorchester, it's all wheat straw. It's not reed. All you do is you comb back the top coat and then apply a new coat. But there are traditions over the ridges as well. In Dorchester, we have a simple wrap-over ridge, not a fancy ridge. If you see a fancy ridge, then that's a modern affectation. Again, the evidence for the Cruck Trusses is hidden away now, but if you come into this passageway by one of the cottages, you can see the feet now of both of these curved timbers that make up the truss. It's not only cruck-framed buildings in Dorchester that were only 1.5 stories high. A number of box-framed buildings were too. Here we can see a terrace of 3 late medieval box-framed buildings that was only 1.5 stories high, and their street elevation has been raised, but not the inside. If you go inside these buildings, you'll find that the upper story is still in the roof. But to all intents and purposes, anybody passing by would see these as 17th, 18th century rendered houses. We're here now in the wagon entrance into the George Inn, a coaching inn, and this shows the other school of carpentry. This is box framing, where individual timbers are assembled and built up. You can have shorter lengths of timbers for each story, and so you can build those timber frame buildings very much higher. The George is probably 15th century. And the bracing to the timber frame, these great curved braces that go down from the vertical to the horizontal, these are called tension braces, and they tend to be earlier than the other form of bracing, which is called arch bracing. So we're looking at one of the earliest ranges here. The George, as I say, was a coaching inn, and so we have an accommodation block that we will look at now. By the nature of the material, timber frame buildings are always only 1 room deep. That creates a problem if you're running an inn with accommodation for guests, because you don't want them going through 1 room into the next room and into the next room to get to their beds. So the device to overcome that is to create a gallery on one side, and the George is a galleried inn. The gallery at the George is one of the best surviving examples in the country. But the other coaching inns in Dorchester also had galleries, the White Hart and the Bull Inn. Their galleries are no longer visible, but the same device was needed to get to the accommodation. The George has all sorts of other things to show us. If we look at the range Opposite the gallery, we will see a different sort of timber framing. This range here is of a later date than the gallery range. You can tell that by the bracing. You see that the brace now goes upwards from the vertical to the horizontal. That's known as arch bracing and is exactly the reverse of tension bracing. That tends to come in the 16th century, still very decorative and curving. As it develops into the 17th century, they become shorter and straighter because all you're trying to do is reinforce the angle of the square of the framing. The street frontage of the George is entirely rendered. Although it's timber framed, fashion has dictated that you cover up that timber frame. It's only in the yard that we've been able to analyse the various periods of timber framing, again, away from the public view. Opposite the George is another galleried accommodation block, but this is monastic. This is the Abbey guest house within the Abbey precinct. Because it's in the Abbey precinct, it's got a stone frontage, but attached to that is a timber-framed range, and you can see it's got that tension bracing that is characteristic of the earlier methods of framing box-framed buildings. This is the only building in Dorchester that has been dated by the science of dendrochronology. That's the measuring of the tree rings, measuring growth, and is a very accurate way of dating timbers. The timbers that we used here were felled in the spring of 1444 and further timbers in 1445. So because timber was used green, that is, it's easier to work when it's just been felled. Timber was not seasoned, it was used straight away. So we can be pretty certain that this building dates to around 1445, and that dates the use of tension braces. Let's go and have a look at the evidence for the gallery. In the courtyard of the guest house, you can see the timber-framed gallery at first floor level, or at least you can if you've been inside. It's now been blocked off. It's not open like the gallery at the George, but there is a corridor inside. That upper story is jettied. Jettying became very fashionable in Dorchester. The George has got lots of jetties on its street frontage, for example. I think it started as a structural device. With box frame buildings, as you assemble them, you can have shorter lengths of timber for each floor. But if you joined those two timbers together in a flush elevation, then that would be a very weak point. If you project the floor out and then put your upper story joint above the end of the floor joists, then you've got a very strong structural device. So I think it started as a structural thing, but then became fashionable. This simple box-framed cottage is set well away from the high street on the edge of the Abbey churchyard, and so its timber frame has never been covered up. And it tells you a very interesting story. If you look at it, on one side, the timber is very much more substantial than on the other side. It started off as a tiny squatter's cottage on the common land just by the edge of the River Thames. It still floods in the winter. The side to my right is the original part of the framework, and the side to my left is a later addition. And what's even more interesting is you can see the original infill between the timber frame. On the earliest part, it's wattle and daub, and wattle and daub is a very good infill for a timber frame building because the wattles can move with the timber frame. Timber moves, it expands and contracts according to the weather, and the mud that's the daub can be replaced if it begins to crack. The infill on the later half of this cottage is brick, and that's stems from the fashion in brick in the village, and it's a very poor material as infill for timber because brick is inert. So if the timber moves, the brick remains static and you get cracks and panels fall out. It's also a very bad insulating material. Because of the depth of the timber, you've only got one brick thick, you haven't got a cavity wall. That must be pretty cold in that side of the cottage. Here in Rotten Row, many of the houses are timber framed as they are in the high street, but there are a few buildings that have used stone. Now, there is no decent building stone in Dorchester. Dorchester lies on the Galt clays over the river gravels. Chalk or clunch is available towards the Chilterns, and it's a lousy building stone. It's very soft, very easily worked, but the surface spalls, that is, it flakes away. And you can see that on the building behind me. And if we look in close up, you'll see how they've tried to disguise that. The surface of the stone here has flaked away, as you can see. The blocks of stone are quite rough, but they've disguised that by running the mortar over the face of the stone and then incising lines so that they look as if they're regular blocks. We will see it better on another of the cottages in Rotten Row, but you can see it here as well. The important thing is that the mortar should be softer than the stone so that it acts as a sacrifice under weathering and you can easily repoint it. If you try and use cement render, then that's harder than the chalk and that accelerates the deterioration of the chalk. Here's another example of the use of chalk, and you see very clearly the effect of inscribed lines to give a regular appearance. Chalk is so soft that when it's used in Dorchester, it's always in association with brick. Brick for where you need strength on the corners of the buildings, the window openings and the door openings. So you always have brick dressings with chalk in between. Brick transformed Dorchester from the late 17th century onwards. There's a splendid example here at the High Street end of Rotten Row. Bricks were made locally. They have distinctive colours because of the clay and distinctive patterns because of the way that they were fired. You tended to get the headers, that's the short end of the brick, which were closer to the fire, would glaze. And so they come out dark. And it wasn't very long before people saw this as an opportunity to make pattern. So you can see a house like this, where the headers have been used to make a checker pattern. The stretchers, that's the long side of the brick, are in their orange form, part of that checker pattern. And you always find orange bricks round the windows, on the corners and round the door openings. What's interesting about this building is that it's the public facade that is in brick. If you actually go and look at the back elevation, that's in that poor chalk stone that we've already seen. The local brickworks also, of course, produced clay tiles, and we find that many of the buildings in Dorchester, like the one behind me, that were originally thatched, the thatch was removed and replaced with this modern material. Where you find chalk, you also find flint, and the decorative potential was used to full effect in some of the buildings in Dorchester. Here, this facelift of a timber frame building, a facelift carried out in 1715. They used both brick and flint to provide this lovely pattern. This 18th century house in Bridgend, the whole of the front elevation is of vitrified headers, these darker headers. So pleased are they with the effect that it has. When the sun's in the right direction, it does actually sparkle. Because they had to be carefully selected when they came out of the kiln, vitrified headers tended to be expensive. And so on the same house, you'll see that the side elevations, the vitrified headers are used much more sparingly. It's only on the principal elevation that you compose it entirely of headers. And the house opposite has exactly the same formation. The building behind me is the chapel and the schoolroom of the primitive Methodist church. It was built in 1839 and it was built of cob. We have documentary evidence that the 7 labourers who bought this plot of land built their chapel out of the earth on which it stood. And I think the 19th century sees the popularity of cob in Dorchester, whether it's a revival, whether it's something to do with nonconformist religion and that you use the earth to create your place of worship or not, I don't know. But we will see another chapel in Watling Lane, also built of cob, and many of the boundary walls that you see in Dorchester seem to be of the 19th century and not earlier. The primitive Methodist chapel is in Bridge End, and Bridge End is called that because this was where the road originally went to the medieval bridge before that was replaced in 1815. When the medieval bridge was demolished, then the land, the wasteland by the side of it, was used for ordinary people's cottages. And this is a good example where there's just a jumble of different building materials. Brick, stone, the exposed stone that you can see, I think might well have come from the demolished medieval bridge. In Watling Lane is another nonconformist chapel built of cob. This is slightly earlier than the one at Bridge End. This is 1837, and this was built as a Baptist chapel. It's attached to an earlier cottage. You can see that it's cob, partly through the thickness of the walls, if you look in the windows, the curved nature of the corner of the building. And what they've done, interestingly enough, is they've rendered the cob and incised it with masonry lines to make it look like stone. Here in Malthouse Lane is another 19th century cob building. This one was built as a cottage. It was built after the railways came to Oxfordshire because it's got a Welsh slate roof. It's entirely of cob, and the clue is in its name. It's called Cobb Cottage. This charming summer house now adorns the gardens of Port House, a gentleman's house in Watling Lane. It's probably 19th century and it's entirely of cob. At Bishop's Court Farm, there's another cob building. This is an animal shelter with a thatched roof and beautiful cob walls. They were repaired about 20 years ago. There's just one opening, and you could see that the cattle had rubbed themselves against the door and rounded off the opening. It really is a very beautiful cob structure, and again, it's 19th century. The most prominent and perhaps well-known cob structure in the village is this thatched wall in the High Street. Again, I think this is 19th century because originally it formed part of a structure that had animal houses, poultry, on the inside in the farmyard. That should have shown on the 1846 tithe map, and it is not there. So I think this is later 19th century rather than earlier. You can see that there is a prominent thatched roof giving a very wide overhang to throw the water off, and there is a stone foundation. In the 18th century, many of the thatched roofs in the village were sacrificed for that modern material, clay tiles. But now, in the 21st century, thatch is once again valued. 3 houses are being rethatched in the village at the moment, this one with the traditional wrap-over ridge. It's an interesting reflection on changing taste that we started off by looking at the earliest building material in Dorchester, which was timber. And here behind me is one of the most recent houses to have been built in the village, and it's of timber too. The porch pays respect to the Cruck tradition in Dorchester, and the rest of the building is box framed. So we have the 2 schools of carpentry coming together here in the 21st century. Times might change, but there's a wonderful continuity to history.